I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines. Hey folks, so first I just want to start off by apologizing for the lateness of this episode. As usual, I seem to have more work to do than I can handle, and that includes extra days driving truck and then having to make up that time on Brainstorm and spending time with my family. So this episode is about a week late, probably. Enough of excuses, though. This is the 7th episode in my social justice. At this point, I'm running out of anti-SJW interviews, but some of my pro-social justice interviews are going to be a bit more specialized, so they're more focused on specific argument. This is one of those. Ari Stillman is a co-host on the Gaytheist Manifesto, the SJW Circle Jerk, and the Cis Are Getting Out of Hand. I think that's what it's called. They are a well-known personality in the Skeptic and Atheist podcast community and have appeared on a number of other shows as a guest. They also happen to be educated in psychology and have experience in dealing with therapists, PTSD, and trigger warnings. I hope that this interview can give some people who may not have experienced this perspective a bit more insight as to what PTSD actually is and why trigger warnings aren't the end of the world. So that's about all I have to say about that. Here it is, my interview with Ari Stillman. Why don't you introduce yourself and, I guess we'll start there.
Okay. Well, my name is Ari Stillman. I'm the best known for being the co-host of the Gaytheist Manifesto with Callie Wright, which is a podcast exploring the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBTQ rights movement. So we talk a lot about trans issues mostly because we're both trans, so that's really important to us, especially in the climate that we're in now. I also do a little side podcast with Jeremiah Traeger called the SJW Circle Jerk. Nice. Which we just put out pretty much whenever we feel like it, whenever we have time. It usually ends up being like every 2 weeks or so. Just talking about pretty much whatever we want to talk about because that's something that the atheist movement desperately needs is more podcasts with two people just talking about whatever. We thought there was a really big hole in that genre, and we wanted to bring that service to our community. So
for sure,
we do that. Yeah. And I guess I'm here to talk about PTSD and trigger warnings. And my qualifications in that area are I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. I am starting my master's degree this fall in developmental psychology, doing research on how children develop mental health disorders. And I have PTSD. So there you go.
Okay.
Personal experience and education.
That's absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
So I guess most of these conversations, I start with the question, what is social justice? But because I want to focus more on trigger warnings with this, what is a trigger warning?
Okay, so I guess we should get into what a trigger is, first of all.
Sure.
Because, I'm sure if you are a citizen of the internet, you've seen those triggered memes with the the blurry girl in the background.
It didn't even Joe Rogan named his recent comedy special Triggered or something.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, in the broad sense, there's kind of a broad sense and then a specific sense, specifically with PTSD. So in a broad sense, in the mental health context, a trigger is any kind of stimulus which can either worsen a person's mental health or cause some kind of episode, or it depends on what kind of, mental health diagnosis we're working with. But generally, it's any kind of stimulus that would cause a negative effect in the person who has a mental illness. So, for PTSD, which is the big topic when it comes to trigger warnings, it's things like, talking about sexual assault or talking about child abuse or, images of war, that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that people mostly focus on. But, there are other things that can be triggers as well. For example, people who are recovering alcoholics are often told in their recovery to avoid alcohol because that triggers the desire in them to drink. So,
right, like they're not supposed to go to bars and stuff, eh?
Right, because it puts them in that same situation that tempts them. They remember what it's like when they were drinking, and all these memories come back, and it's really tempting for them to, go back into their old habits. Same thing, for example, like with self-harm, people who, self-harm, if they hear people talking about it or see images of it, it might bring to mind, what it feels like for them to self-harm, and they might, be triggered, to use that buzzword,
right,
into, having those same kinds of feelings that would normally cause them to self-harm. So, again, we mostly focus on PTSD with this because I think that's the big area that people are concerned about and gets the most media attention. But more generally, just a trigger is anything in mental health that could negatively impact a person. So when we're talking about trigger warnings, this is usually in the context of academics, but it could be in any kind of situation. It's pretty much just saying, hey, I'm about to talk about this thing, which if you have certain mental health condition could be disturbing for you to hear about, or could negatively impact your emotions or your thought processes or your behavior. So, the examples I listed before, like talking about sexual assault and abuse and war and all sorts of things. Those are kind of the big ones. So if you're about to talk about, I don't know, like your experience with abuse, you say, hey, I'm about to talk about abuse that I experienced. If that's not something that you feel safe listening to, now is your chance to not listen to what I'm about to say.
Okay. And the intent is that, I guess, if this is bad for you to hear, then here's your heads up kind of thing. Exactly.
And that's the real sticking point that I think people don't understand about what trigger warnings actually are, because especially in the academic context, they get scared about, stifling free speech, and professors can't talk about anything offensive because it might trigger somebody. How are we supposed to engage with different ideas? That's what college is supposed to be about, is about debating and hearing new points of view and, listening to all sides and hearing things that might upset you. But the thing that people don't understand is, first of all, being upset is not even close to the same thing as being triggered. It's not even on the same realm. If you're upset, you're like, I don't like this, whatever, I'm going to get over it. Depending on what kind of mental health thing you're dealing with, for example, with PTSD, if, there are always different ranges of severity as there are with anything. So some people, when they get triggered, they might just experience some things like pounding heart, sweating, lightheadedness. They might have a full-on panic attack where they can't breathe and they think they're having a heart attack and they're dying. They might have a flashback. It varies depending on the trigger and depending on the person and the severity of their symptoms. So really what we're trying to do is just prepare the person to be able to decide whether or not they are in a place where they are able to listen to this kind of content, which is, it's not to say that you can't talk about it at all. It's just to say it would be nice if you let us know before you are going to talk about it, so that if this is something that would be harmful for us to hear, if we're not in a good place on that day, maybe we didn't get enough sleep, maybe some other stuff is going on in our life and we would really be better served, and it would ruin our entire day or our entire week for us to have to think about this traumatic experience that we went through. Then, here's our chance to save ourselves all that grief and,
right.
The setback that it can cause if you're not in the right place.
Okay. So what do you think of the criticism that it actually enables an aversion type behavior that in the long run isn't mentally healthy?
Right. That is something that I hear a lot, is like, oh, if we expose them to their triggers, that's exposure therapy, and exposure therapy is good for you because you can learn that, it's not actually anything to be afraid of, which is a good intention. But unfortunately, you are not the person's therapist, and it is the person's therapist's job to decide, it takes years of training to be able to properly provide therapy to someone. Some person on the internet is not going to have the tools to be able to do this in a safe way. And if they expose you to something that is, brings up a traumatic memory for you or traumatic feelings, it can have the opposite effect if you're not adequately prepared, if you're not trained in grounding techniques, how to calm yourself down when you're having a panic attack, different different cognitive behavioral skills that you learn in a therapist's office. If the person who's trying to expose you to that has absolutely no idea of any of that, they don't know what your journey is, where you are right now. They don't know, how long you've been in therapy or if you've been in therapy at all. They're just making an assumption that, hey, if I talk about this thing, it's good for you. It's not always good for you. Therapy is a thing that, requires a lot of training, like I said, and there are specific steps that need to be followed with your mental health professional. So it's just giving the person the opportunity to decide for themselves if they are in a place to be able to handle that trigger at the moment, hopefully working with their therapist if they're in a place where they have access to that, which is another huge problem. But, the person can work with their therapist to decide when it's safe for them to be exposed to certain triggers and what to do when they experience, a flashback or a panic attack or whatever it is. So it's just not blindsiding them. If, like, for example, there was a topic, the atheist community always gets on these topics that make the rounds on every show for 2 or 3 weeks and then kind of, peter out.
Right.
And there was one topic in particular a few months ago that was really triggering to me personally. And Jeremiah listens to a lot of the same podcasts that I do. And he said he listened to a podcast before I did. And he said, hey, at this point, they talk about this topic, just letting you know. And so I decided not to listen to the podcast that week because I was warned about what the topic was. And then another time, that was a few weeks later, I was feeling a lot better about the whole situation and I was able to handle it. And he listened to another podcast before I did it. And he said, hey, they talk about this topic again at this point. And I said, thanks for letting me know. I really appreciate it. I am going to be good to listen to it. And I listened to it and I was fine because I knew what was coming and I could decide for myself whether or not I was in the right space to be able to listen to that.
So it's almost like, it sounds like if you can mentally prepare yourself, then maybe you can expose yourself to these things that would otherwise have a triggering effect.
Yeah. It depends on the person and what stage of recovery that they're in. It might be the case that they can not safely hear about certain topics or be exposed to certain things without, risking some sort of setback. It might depend on the day. Some days are better than others. Some days you're feeling strong and you can handle it. And other days, maybe you didn't get enough sleep or there's something else that's stressing you out and your body just goes into fight or flight mode, against your will. It's not something that can be controlled. So yeah, it depends. But really the whole idea behind the trigger warning is to let the person decide for themselves whether or not this is a good idea. It's all about personal liberty and freedom and choice. I'm sure everyone loves that.
The opposite of what I've heard. Yeah, isn't it about stifling freedom and shutting down liberty?
Right.
No, I
don't understand that.
Where do you think some of these arguments come from? Like, is it just an armchair psychologist type idea that, we can just expose people to whatever we want and they just have to deal with it and it's good for them? Or is there, did it come from somewhere? Is there research that said that at one time?
There are lots of different aspects to this. And I think one of the big ones is this prevailing idea in society that, mental illness is a fundamental weakness and that, for example, if you have PTSD and you are, negatively impacted by certain, stimuli in your environment, then you should just, decide not to do that. And you should just be rational. And, this thing isn't going to hurt me. This stuff happened in the past and I'm safe now.
Right.
And you should just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And, I had bad stuff happen to me and I was fine. Well, I'm glad for you that you were fine and that you got through life without trigger warnings, but, have some compassion for the people who are struggling. So yeah, just the whole mental illness isn't a real illness. Like you can just think your way out of it if you want to. You can just have a stronger constitution and just fight your way through stuff. Is a really, really damaging narrative that mentally ill people hear a lot, and it causes you to doubt yourself a lot. That's something that I work on in therapy a lot, is feeling like I'm weak because I can't control my feelings a lot of times. Right. And my therapist keeps going, but you have an illness. Like, none of this is your fault.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It seems quite common to have videos or whatever talking about even depression. I guess PTSD doesn't necessarily get the same attention, but it's quite often like, oh, we'll just suck it up. You can feel better for depression. Like, oh, well, you're not actually depressed. You're just sad.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess from your educational background, are trigger warnings considered the norm for, or is it considered the best way for people to interact with the world from, I guess, the psychologist's perspective?
So there isn't at this point any published research that directly looks at that. I'm sure it's probably in the pipeline because this has been a big topic, but in psychology, it takes a long time to do these sorts of studies and to get them published. It can take several years for stuff to actually get published once it's conducted. So there, as far as I know, there isn't any direct research, but there is definitely a lot of research on there about what happens to people with PTSD when they are in the clinical literature. They don't use the word triggered. They use the words they're having re-experiencing symptoms, which can range anywhere from intrusive memories to physical manifestations, flashbacks, panic attacks, nightmares. All those sorts of things are covered in the DSM as re-experiencing symptoms of PTSD. So there's a lot of research which shows that when you're having re-experiencing symptom, it is a hallmark of PTSD, and it is definitely negatively affecting your quality of life and your emotional health. And that's what PTSD is. Otherwise it would just be depression probably, or anxiety, or some other but the re-experiencing symptoms are the real crux of what PTSD is. I've got a lot of links on that. I could send you some if you want to put some in the notes for this episode.
Yeah, I would definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I have this big document because Eli Bosnick went on The Thinking Atheist to talk about trigger warnings and safe spaces, and he was like, "Ari, help me!" So I
Nice.
made this big old document with links directly to studies and other websites, and also some journalism. For example, some opinion pieces by professors who are like, "I am a psychology professor, and this is why I use trigger warnings in my class," and sorts of things like this.
No, that sounds great. It strikes me as kind of an odd scenario because when somebody comes back from, say, a war zone, and nobody tells them, "Oh, well, suck it up, go see the new movie on Iraq."
Yeah.
But somehow, like a student who's experienced some other form of trauma is supposed to just go to class and just face whatever is put in front of them, whether it can trigger their symptoms or not.
Yeah, think of the troops, people. If you would do it for a member of the military, you should consider doing it for other people too, because they're also humans who deserve to have a decent quality of life as best they can.
Yeah, it's almost like people are people.
Yeah. The whole thing with the military, that definitely gets the most attention with PTSD. So a lot of people don't realize that actually the majority of people with PTSD don't get it from war.
Right.
People get it, as I've mentioned before, from childhood abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual assaults, even things like being in a natural disaster or a car accident. The the definition of PTSD is that you have to have experienced at least one situation in which you felt that your life or physical safety was in danger. And that could be anything. It could be a war, or it could be that you were in a tornado. So nothing in the PTSD diagnostic criteria says you have to have been, shot at or or been bombed or anything. So people definitely have a misconception about that.
It's an interesting subject. I was talking to a lady yesterday who she was quite under the impression that trigger warnings were doing more harm than good. Mm-hmm. And I tried to kind of push back a little bit and say, like, I think that there's people in the psychological community who think that these are beneficial. I mean, I don't have sources to say that, but I have read people saying that it has a positive effect. Yeah.
And this isn't necessarily a settled question, again, because there isn't any direct research on this, but I know from talking with, my own therapist and other mental health professionals who specialize in trauma and PTSD that they almost universally are in favor of, reasonable trigger warnings, And another objection that I want to bring up too is people say, well, anything could be a trigger. Like, you could be triggered by a spoon if you had some sort of traumatic memory with a spoon. So do I have to give a trigger warning for everything? Like, how am I supposed to know which things to use for trigger warnings?
Right.
And there is a grain of truth to that, because, if someone had a traumatic experience with a spoon, they could very well be triggered by a spoon, and you wouldn't necessarily know anything about that, of course. In that case, it would be the person's responsibility to let you know that, this is something that is going to have a huge negative effect on me. So please be mindful of that, and please respect what I tell you about my mental health.
Right.
But of course, there are things that are a lot more likely than spoons to be triggers, such as all the things that I've mentioned previously. Yeah. Common causes of PTSD. So
spoon-related trauma is significantly less common.
Right. I mean, there's a gradation, as there is with anything, but right. I forget what the name of I don't know if it's a fallacy or just a principle in logic that, a line has to be drawn somewhere, and it could be drawn anywhere along this gradation. But, we're just making a reasonable assumption that, hey, if you're going to talk about someone being violently raped, some people might not be okay with hearing about that.
Yeah.
Trigger warning, I just talked about rape.
Yeah, I suppose when I air this, I should probably mention that.
Yeah. And another thing, too, is that it's usually not the mention of the word or that this thing exists that is right. An issue. Like, if somebody has severe PTSD, that might be a problem. Like, if you say the word rape, like, most people are not going to be triggered by just the word. Like, they know that it exists. They've been through it. It's not that they want to pretend it doesn't exist. It's when it gets more graphic, like more graphic details, or seeing it portrayed on TV or in a movie, or, anything that would connect with them on a personal level so that they would be reminded of what happened to them. That would be something which would be much more likely to be a trigger than just a mentioning of the fact that it exists.
Yeah. 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 It sounds reasonable to say that the word war isn't going to trigger somebody necessarily, but witnessing a scene of warlike conditions might have that same effect.
Yeah.
Or whatever other scenario there might be, not to exclude
one that you hear a lot about is fireworks, because the popping noises can sound a lot like gunfire, and for people who have been in active war zones, that brings them back to times when they were surrounded by gunfire and their life was in danger. So that's a trigger for them. It's not that they know in their head that it's just fireworks, it's not guns, but your body reacts to it it's a fight or flight response. It's like if you've been, attacked by a dog, you might get a phobia of dogs, even though you know that not all dogs are like this dog that attacked you. But every time you see a dog, you start to feel scared because of what happened to you. It's the same sort of thing. In your head that it's this is the present. It's not the past. It's not going to hurt you, but your body is reacting as if it were, what happened in the past. And that's essentially what a flashback is. It's not always necessarily like you're having like a hallucination and you feel like you're right back in there and you can't tell what's reality and what's just a memory of what happened. That certainly can happen in extreme cases, but most of the time it's just like an emotional feeling or a physical feeling, usually both, or a pattern of thinking that has you feeling like emotionally and physically like you're back in that place. So again, more myth busting here. Busting the myths left and right.
Right on. Do they know what's happening in a person's brain when they're experiencing a traumatic flashback?
I suppose it would probably depend on the severity, but I haven't read any research on this. I'm sure there is some. Well, it might be hard to induce a flashback in a person while they're in an fMRI machine, yeah. But I would imagine that you would, see a lot of activity in emotional centers of the brain for sure. Right. And I'm sure, if I'm not mistaken, there is research showing that people with PTSD and other anxiety disorders have higher base levels of cortisol, which is a hormone that's associated with stress and can have, negative effects on your body. So, okay. It's science. It's right. The brain. Everything is the brain.
Everything is the brain. Yeah.
There's no emotions and then the brain. Like, emotions are part of the brain. Everything that you experience is experienced in your brain.
Yep, for sure. I guess quite often people put the ideas of trigger warnings and safe spaces in the same context. Is there a relation between the two?
Vaguely. Not really.
Not really.
They're similar in that these debates are centered around colleges and universities, and that they have connections with mental well-being, and that there are a lot of straw men about what they are supposed to be about.
Right.
So that's how they're similar. But how people use the term safe space colloquially is not the way that people in social justice circles use that term. If you think about, for example, like an LGBT support group, you go to whatever facility that you're meeting at, you hang out with other people there who are all LGBT identified. They understand what it's like to be part of that minority. You talk to one another, you share your frustrations, you get advice and support from the people around you. That's really the heart of what social justice-y people consider to be a safe space. It's not a space where you're not allowed to say anything offensive. It's that, this is a place that's reserved for this marginalized group because they don't have that safety that people who aren't marginalized would experience in their everyday life. So, sometimes they have to retreat into these groups that's just meant for them because they're always being, assaulted with all this stuff coming at them from people who don't have their same experience. And also, you always hear about a safe space as like, oh, you're not allowed to say stuff, like you're not allowed to disagree, and you have to walk on eggshells all the time to avoid offending someone. And that's almost the opposite of how a safe space actually works. The idea of a safe space is that when somebody says something that is incorrect or offensive or harmful or whatever term you want to use, they get politely challenged on that. And the idea is to actually have a discussion about that, within boundaries. When things get abusive or, when there's yelling involved or, of course, we don't want any physical fighting to be happening because this is supposed to be a support group.
Right.
That's when they reserve the right to say, okay, you are disrupting the environment here. You're disrupting this sense of community that we're supposed to have. So we're going to politely ask you not to come back to this space. because you're ruining it for everyone else. It's the same kind of thing in any social circle. If somebody's being antagonistic, if somebody's, hurting people's feelings on purpose because they think it's funny or whatever's going on, you don't want to hang out with that person. They have a right to be able to say it, but you also have a right to say, I don't want to associate with you. So
it's not, it's not
sorry,
actually imposing on anybody's actual freedom of speech, as some people like to say.
Exactly. And I have been in lots of groups that use, so-called safe space rules. And the idea is if somebody says something, you say, hey, like, I disagree with what you just said, or what you just said was incorrect. And you have a polite discussion in front of the rest of the group about that. So you're fostering discussion, you're encouraging discussion about this, and hopefully you come to an understanding, or the person realizes that what they said was wrong, and they decide that they're going to try and work on that and think about that in the future. Or the person who was offended or triggered or whatever by what they said realizes that that's not actually what they meant, and they come to a better understanding. So the whole point of it is to foster a healthy, non-abusive conversation. And of course, like any group, they reserve the right to kick people out if they're being assholes.
Right. It sounds like I just was talking to a social scientist the other day, and he's talking about his classroom, and it sounds like this social justice type mentality isn't about stifling conversation the way some people seem to portray it. It's almost like it fosters a more civil conversation where ideas can almost be spread in a better way.
That's the way we see it anyway. The people who are against trigger warnings and safe spaces, like we've been talking about, for the most part, have never experienced what these things are like. They've only heard about what they've seen in the media about, whiny college kids complaining that their professors, right, assigning a book that has physical violence in it or something, and they want to be able to get an A in the class without reading the book. And, I think stuff like that does probably occasionally happen, but that is just so not what we're about at all.
Is that just so far out of the realm of norm for these ideas that is it easily dismissible, or does one have to address those things in some way?
It might be different since I've been an undergrad. I graduated in 2014. So there's been some progress since then in social justice-y things. I graduated a little before this topic kind of took off. So I'm not sure what things are like in universities now, but from my personal experience and from talking to people who are currently in college or recently graduated, this stuff is not really anything common at all. And if it is, then most reasonable people on any side of the argument are saying, yeah, that's not a reasonable thing to expect. Like you can't not talk about these subjects in class. There are reasonable expectations that you have for trigger warnings, which is to say, hey, I'm about to talk about this thing. Maybe if for mental health reasons you can't participate in a discussion or an assignment, you can go and get a note from your mental health provider, and I'll provide you with a different assignment for you to do that would accomplish the same sorts of things. I think those are reasonable accommodations as universities are supposed to provide for people with any kind of disability, whether it's a physical, or a mental health disability. You're supposed to provide reasonable accommodations for your students so they can succeed. Right. And I think trigger warnings are helping people with mental health concerns, especially PTSD, but any kind of mental health concern, to be able to succeed, because they're not going to be a good student if they're having a panic attack in the middle of class. Right. That's not going to be conducive to their learning if, they have a huge slide because of something that they were exposed to in class that they weren't ready for, and they might even have to have a short hospital stay depending on how serious it is. So we're just trying to help people be better students, because they deserve to be able to take part in university just like anybody else. Humanism, yay.
Yeah, it sounded pretty reasonable the way you said it to me. So I
can't wait to be called a regressive cuck. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. Well, I'm just waiting for it. I haven't had it happen yet, but I'm waiting for the time when I have one of these conversations and somebody actually is willing to say, like, call me a cuck over stuff. Like, I'm just waiting for it. But yeah,
I look forward to being told that I am incorrect about what I believe, and that social justice people actually believe this. Oh, that's weird, because I'm really involved in social justice stuff, and I don't know anyone who believes that. But okay, random guy on the internet, I'm sure you know what you're talking about.
I'm encountering a lot of people who seem to have examples of individuals abusing, say, trigger warnings or safe spaces, or the idea of safe spaces, or even like examples of members of Black Lives Matter being racist, or examples of women being sexist or whatever. Like, and it's always these examples that are, and they use that to almost try and what's the word I'm looking for? Tear the whole thing down, like kind of eliminate all social justice because these examples of bad behavior.
Oh, I've got a great example of that, of how the media is unfortunately really playing into this narrative. So I saw an article, it was probably like 2 months ago or 3 months ago or so. It was from The Guardian, or from some quote unquote objective news source that is, just reporting the facts. It wasn't an op-ed or anything. It was, supposed to be a strict reporting piece,
right? About
how students at a university, this is the way that they phrased it. They were threatening. I can't remember what they were threatening, but basically they were complaining to the school that they didn't want to learn about white philosophers in their philosophy class, and they only wanted to learn about Black philosophers and Asian philosophers. And the article was spinning this like, oh, come on, like this is taking this way too far. Of course there are white philosophers who have made great contributions to schools of philosophy. Of course everybody knows that, and these people are being ridiculous and they're going overboard. And so I was intrigued by this, so I looked into it, and it turned out that this only applied to one class, and this was a class that students in Black and Asian studies were taking, which was supposed to be a philosophy class for them. And they didn't like the fact that almost all of the philosophy that they were being taught in this Black and Asian studies class was from, white people. Right. They're like, hey, we're paying you to learn about Black and Asian studies. And we're taking this class because that's what we want to learn about. And, we're reading about, Plato and Nietzsche and whoever. Right. This is not what we paid for. So if you just dig a little deeper behind the surface, it's not at all what it seems. They weren't being reverse racist or whatever. They were trying to learn about what the class was supposed to teach them about.
Right. If they wanted to learn about ancient Greek philosophers or whatever, that's what they would have taken, or Enlightenment philosophers or whatever, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So they were just upset about the lack of representation in this class of what they were supposed to be taught about. Right. It makes perfect sense if you actually look into the details of what's going on, instead of just seeing the headline about how these students are being reverse racist and they're taking things way too far and, having their safe space and demonizing the poor white men.
Yeah. It's us poor white men, I tell you.
Yeah. You really have it rough.
It's rough. It really is. I don't know. Did I sound sarcastic enough? I hope so. No, I guess we're going on about 40 minutes here. What's something that you wish people knew about trigger warnings, safe spaces, or social justice that maybe is really misrepresented in social media these days.
Oh man, there's so much to talk about. I don't know. We've already covered so much of it. I guess I would really stress the difference between, and this is something that I see on all sides. It's not just like anti-social justice people. I also see social justice people occasionally who take the same sort of tack, confusing being offended or upset with being triggered. And I touched on it earlier in our conversation, but I do see occasionally people co-opting the term on the left, if you want to use the phrase co-opting, but saying like, oh, I'm triggered by this because of, whatever thing. And, I understand being upset by, seeing someone saying some racist stuff or whatever, but unless you have some sort of specific mental health concern where that is actually causing a tangible negative effect, it's not just going to last for, your 10 minutes or 20 minutes or however long it is that you're upset about it.
Right.
It can be extremely intense and extremely, it can last a lot longer than that and have a much bigger impact than just, oh, I'm upset for a few minutes and I couldn't handle it and I need to control what other people say so that I don't ever have to feel upset. It's a totally different ball game with, the actual triggering. So on the right, you hear, oh, you're just offended. Get over it. Everyone gets offended. Everyone gets upset. You're just trying to, keep yourself in a little bubble so you don't ever have to feel these negative feelings that everybody feels. And then occasionally there are people on the left, saying that they were triggered by something that they weren't actually. They were just upset by it, which I don't see too often, but I do see it occasionally.
Enough that it probably feeds the narrative that that's what it means.
Yeah, exactly. So I would just, again, stress there's a huge difference between just your regular old emotions and your having a flashback or a panic attack because of a traumatic experience that happened to you.
That's fair enough. All right. Thanks for talking with me. Is there anything, I guess you already kind of mentioned your shows, but if you want to give the websites or whatever, I'll throw them at the end.
Sure. So I am the co-host of the Gaytheist Manifesto, which is a podcast. You can find that on all the podcast places. The SJW Circle Jerk with Jeremiah is on iTunes and Spreaker. And I'm really active on Facebook and post a lot on there. So if you want to friend me, I am Ari Stillman. And I'm the 13-year-old boy-looking person in the profile picture. And it says I'm the co-host of the Gaytheist Manifesto. So that's how you'll know it's me. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have or provide resources. And I'll send you my list of links that I have. Perfect. So there you go. Hit me up with your questions and whatnot. And don't be abusive because I'll get triggered.
Actually.
That's some PTSD humor right there. That's how you actually do it.
Right. Well, thanks very much for talking with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's fun to do the edumacations.
Yeah, well, I like learning. So.
Learning is fun. Knowledge is power.
Right on. Thanks again, and have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
So that's the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. I follow Ari on Facebook, and they're a very interesting and super cool person. If you don't do anything except listen to them on the Gaytheist Manifesto, then I suggest you do that. It's a great show anyway. Ari's other shows are, as I said in the intro, the SJW Circle Jerk and the Sister Getting Out of Hand, and I'll try to link those in the show notes. There's not a ton to say. I've got some links for resources in the show notes, but as Ari said, there aren't any studies that have been completed on the subject of trigger warnings yet. But based on this interview, I think that they're a good idea, even though the jury is still out on the evidence-based side of things. I have a few little notes here. First off, I thought it was extremely valuable that Ari defined what a trigger was and made the differentiation between being triggered and being offended. Quite a bit we find that the two are used interchangeably, so that in a colloquial sense, triggered now means offended, even though that's not what it means when people who are involved in social justice use it. It seems apparent to me that when one uses the definition of a trigger as something that can incite a type of psychological episode where somebody re-experiences their trauma, then it seems that we're left with only two options. And one is to either use trigger warnings so that people aren't re-traumatized, or we don't use trigger warnings, and these people simply don't have the same access to education as people who don't have PTSD. You might remember my interview with Randy Tyson, and he kind of condescendingly gave me an F for skepticism when I said that trigger warnings are for people with PTSD, but I think that this entire interview is kind of a refutation of his argument. Sometimes people with mental illnesses need special accommodation in the same way that we build ramps for people with wheelchairs. The pushback against trigger warnings and accommodation for mental illness, I think, speaks to the invisible nature of illnesses and the stigmatization of them. We can't see it, so it doesn't seem like a real illness to us. Ari mentioned that sometimes they just need to stay home because they're having a bad day. And I don't know if the language available really does justice to the idea. People with mental illness don't have bad days the way that neurotypical people do. They live with these issues every day, and it can be debilitating at times. I want to emphasize another one of Ari's points. They mentioned that exposure therapy shouldn't be administered by untrained people, and some of the anti-trigger warning rhetoric seems to be centered on the idea that exposure helps and avoidance is bad. And that's partly true. Controlled exposure after learning coping skills is helpful, and on some level it is necessary to go through this step in order to achieve a better mental health. This isn't the same thing as being exposed to a trigger without a warning in an uncontrolled environment, though. This view of exposure therapy, where one learns the skills and tools to deal with their trauma, seems to me to fit quite well with the concept of trigger warnings. I imagine there will be studies done to determine this eventually, but for now, this seems good enough for me to administer trigger warnings or to use trigger warnings. So that's pretty much all the notes I had. We joked about being called a cuck, and it's funny because I have been called a cuck multiple times now on Twitter, so I think that's hilarious. Ari mentioned the group of students who wanted to learn about African and Asian philosophers other than European philosophers in their African and Asian studies class or school. Yeah, in their African and Asian studies philosophy class. I covered this a little bit when Randy and I talked, and that link will be in the show notes. Is in the show notes for the interview with Randy. I want to thank Ari again for coming on. They were super cool and actually seemed excited for the project the way I originally planned it. So I apologize for changing strategies in the time after this interview. So like I said before, you can find Ari by listening to any of their shows linked in the show notes, and I recommend you do. You can find more of these episodes at Spreaker.com/show/thehardcoreskepticexamines. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, and just about anywhere else you can find podcasts. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic and like my Facebook page, facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. If you want to support my work, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Hardcore Skeptic. Thanks very much to the patrons of this project. Chris Watson of the Podunk Polymath podcast, Marissa Alexa McCool of the Inciting Incident podcast, and Trav Mamone of the By Any Means podcast. Remember to check out my other show, The Brainstorm Podcast, at thebrainstormpodcast.com and brainstormblog.net. Positively Skeptical, the show me and Gummy were going to do, is put on the back burner for now. But we've been batting some ideas around for a different kind of show, so stay tuned. We may have updates about that. So thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.